Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming for our second virtual panel today, which I think will fit in very nicely with some of the topics that were just discussed in the last one. Maybe we'll get into some more sort of details about some of the opportunities and challenges for digital health tools, specifically in the mental health and substance use and violence space. So we have a super exciting set of panelists here with us today to help us have what I hope will be a really interesting discussion about, again, some of those thorny but really exciting issues in this space. But before we dive into that, let me just first introduce myself, and then I'll do the same for each of the panelists that we have with us today. So I'm Tyler Wray, and I'm the Edens Family Assistant Professor of Healthcare Communications and Technology at the Brown University School of Public Health. And here I lead research and teach about sort of ways of using digital tools to help people change, and we hope to sort of make healthier decisions. So a lot of the work that our group does involves exploring ways of, for example, translating behavior change techniques to the digital world and hopefully capturing the strengths of each technology to sort of help make those techniques more profound and resonant. So on our panel today, we have, in alphabetical order, Dr. Matthew Diamond, who currently serves as Chief Medical Officer for Digital Health at the FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health, where he is senior clinical expert and point of contact for clinical issues related to digital health medical devices. So in his role at the CDRH, he provides leadership for digital health policy development and implementation for emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence. So before joining the agency, though, Dr. Diamond has served on the leadership teams of several technology companies, both large and small, including as Chief Medical Officer at Nokia, as Medical Director at both Fossil Group and the startup Misfit Wearables. So thanks for joining us, Dr. Diamond. And next we have Dr. Jessilyn Dunn, who is currently Assistant Professor of Biomedical Engineering, Biostatistics, and Bioinformatics at Duke University. And Dr. Dunn's research focuses on biomedical data science and mobile health. And her work has included the use of multi-omics, wearable sensor, and electronic health records integration and digital biomarker discovery. She's the director of the Big Ideas Laboratory, whose goal is to detect, treat, and prevent chronic and acute diseases through digital health innovation. And her work has been internationally recognized with media coverage from the NIH Director's Blog to Wired and Time magazines, and also in US News and World Report. So thanks for being with us here as well, Dr. Dunn. We also have with us Dr. Kira Radinsky, who is the chairperson and CTO of Diagnostic Robotics, which focuses on harnessing artificial intelligence to make healthcare better, cheaper, and more widely available. Previously, Dr. Radinsky founded the company SalesPredict, which was acquired by eBay in 2016, and then went on to serve as chief scientist at eBay. She's been recognized internationally for her work at Technion and Microsoft Research, developing algorithms recognizing the early warning signs of globally impactful events like epidemics and political unrest. And in 2013, Dr. Radinsky was also named one of MIT Technology Review's 35 Young Innovators Under 35. And in 2015, Forbes included her in among their 30 under 30 rising stars of enterprise tech. So thanks for being here as well, Dr. Radinsky. And finally, we have Dr. Mimi Winsberg, who is the Chief Medical Officer and co-founder of Brightside Health, a telemental health company that offers personalized and data-driven treatments for depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions. Dr. Winsberg is a Stanford-trained board-certified psychiatrist with 25 years of clinical experience and expertise in applying digital tools and therapeutics to improve behavioral health, increase engagement, and benefit outcomes. She's formerly served as the head of psychiatry at Ginger, psychiatrist at Facebook's Health Center, and a medical director at Lyra Health. She also appears regularly on Good Morning America, and her work has been featured in Fast Company, Bloomberg Business Week, GQ, Glamour, and Business Insider. And she's on track to publish her first book coming soon called Speaking in Thumbs later this year. So thanks for joining us as well, Dr. Winsberg. It is a huge pleasure to have such an accomplished panel and to get the chance to chat with all of you just a bit about the state of tech and mental health. So the first question I had for everybody is, of course, just the obligatory sort of starting panel question, just to get us warmed up before we dig into some of the thornier issues. And that is, besides your own work, besides the work that you do, what do you think the biggest priorities are in terms of trying to address mental health issues with digital tools? Like, what are some of the areas that you're most excited about in terms of the impact that they may have on public health? How about we start with you first, Dr. Winsberg?
Sure, sorry, I had to unmute. So I think there are a lot of companies and a lot of platforms out there right now that are addressing the access issue, which is, of course, huge. A lot of people have trouble accessing mental health care, and providing a marketplace to connect patients and providers is very important. And, clearly a lot of work is being done in that. But I would say that really access in itself is not enough, and that what I'm looking towards are tools that can really drive quality, which has been somewhat present in our field, but also somewhat lacking. And what we would like to see is more measurement-based care, tools that can address populations that have more severe symptoms. I think to really move the needle with the epidemic that we're having in this country right now, we can't just skim the surface of patients with mild to moderate symptoms and connect them with care. We really have to address the range of symptoms that we're seeing and the comorbidities that exist along with psychiatric symptoms and mental health symptoms. So what I'm looking towards in terms of tools are really data-driven treatments. That is to say, coming up with the right treatment for the right patient, that early detection of symptoms. So we know that, for instance, suicide is like the 10th leading cause of death. Are there ways to predict in real time when somebody is at risk? Suicide is obviously associated with very treatable mental health conditions. So, I think that the early detection is really important there. I think closed loop systems become very important. So having patients that can interact with a platform and close the learning gap so that they can understand themselves, where they fall in terms of risk and where they fall in terms of their own symptomatology. And then also step care models. So as many panelists have talked about already, this notion of a tech layer that creates engagement, and then being able to identify the patient's acuity, severity, complexity, and deliver the appropriate care at the appropriate time for them. So those are the things I'm excited about.
Certainly we'll dig into some of those issues, especially with the early detection, quite a bit in this panel, I think. Dr. Radinsky, how about you?
So I'm going to strengthen the things we heard here. Based on our experience, we've been mostly based on billions of claims data and trying to predict deteriorations of patients. At the beginning, we started with a lot of physical deterioration, CHF patient deterioration, COPD, diabetes. But what we found out is that patients that develop even the slightest behavioral health problem are becoming 2 times more expensive. They do much more inpatient visits. They're just sicker. And what we saw, and this surprised me a lot because it's so different from what we see elsewhere in the world, is how much undiagnosed behavioral health problems we already have here. It turns out that 30% of the people are undiagnosed behavioral health. And what would be extremely interesting, and we only started experimenting with this, is how can we identify patterns of behavior from either medical records or claims of those patients and intervene. Here the challenge is, how do you intervene with a healthy person, a person that doesn't know they have a behavioral health problem, and you intervene at the right time. Then you can build all of the personalized care plans, identify how to treat them. But the right time is, should I intervene right now and actually add some psychological treatment, etc.? It might be more expensive, it might be deteriorating. Is the intervention actually helping here? But I think even focusing on the chronic conditions members, that it's already known that even the slightest depression, they start taking the meds, etc., and trying to identify those patterns in time, extremely challenging and interesting. We've seen a surge of those cases, especially with children, especially during COVID, 12 to 18. We're seeing very similar numbers to adults. And the question is, how can we build the right programs for them after the AI already identified that they're deteriorating?
Certainly, and thinking about the whole person, as we saw come up sort of again and again in the last panel as well. Dr. Dunn.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me here. This is a great panel. So I think to build on Dr. Radinsky's points about what comes next once AI can actually diagnose or detect that somebody is deteriorating, there are a lot of challenges in that sort of upstream process of the definition of outcomes. So what does it objectively mean to have a behavioral or mental health disorder? A lot of the challenges in developing those AI and machine learning algorithms are in the actual objective definition of the conditions. And so that's something that, with more digital health data, we can do a better job at defining these, what we call digital biomarkers, that can sort of objectively distinguish between different groups of people with different sorts of conditions. And I think one of the challenges is that the DSM that is sort of being used as the objective metric right now isn't all that objective. And so that really is something that needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. I think we'll dig into that question quite a bit with some later discussion for sure. Great, Dr. Diamond.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. Well, Tyler, thanks, and it's a pleasure to be here. I really agree with all of the exciting directions that my colleagues mentioned. Mimi talks about not only access, but the importance of quality and treating a broad spectrum of patients with moderate and severe mental illness, in addition to milder symptomatology. I appreciated the emphasis on a holistic approach and on metrics as well. And here at the agency, we have a lot of conversations with developers and healthcare providers about ideas that they have. Part of our role at FDA is to provide regulatory clarity, transparency, and predictability about whether a particular product or type of product is actively regulated by the FDA, what would be the type of evidence that would be required for a particular product to receive clearance or approval, if that is required. We're really broadly excited about the promise of digital health for the treatment of behavioral conditions. I can speak just personally. I'm really very excited about the opportunity for technology to help provide that holistic solution, to provide a mind-body approach. There's so much sensor data, rich data provided by wearables, but it is a challenge to integrate them meaningfully into a digital health solution. And so understanding how those physiological measures can be integrated with a therapy program, I think is a really exciting opportunity, and looking forward to seeing more solutions like that.
Great. So maybe I could skip around in the question order just a little bit and just sort of turn in a sort of more focused way to this more specific question I think many of us in the field have about this issue of real-time monitoring and early detection of mental health conditions and so forth. And I thought you would have a pretty interesting perspective on it, just given that you're all actively doing work in this area now. So there's a few sort of uniquely difficult challenges, like many of you already mentioned, to sort of real-time monitoring of mental health conditions and early detection in particular. And I think one of the biggest in my mind is one that Dr. Dunn mentioned just a minute ago, which is that many of the concepts that we're often most interested in trying to monitor or detect are kind of these inherently subclinical experiences that sort of may either precede a full-blown diagnosable disorder, or sometimes, as Dr. Dunn mentioned, even the diagnosable disorder itself is often a collection of sort of self-reported experiences that are not always that sort of well-defined. So, for example, in my world of addictions, often the sort of pre-diagnostic experiences that sort of precede, a diagnosable disorder is, sort of unconstrained, alcohol, drug use, or specific problems, or in suicide, maybe some of these sort of precursors might be self-harm or thoughts of self-harm or things like that. So these things are really probably very difficult to track, particularly in reliable ways. And that makes validation, of course, pretty difficult. So what do you think the most promising ways that are out there are, or maybe that you're sort of thinking about now for addressing that kind of challenge? Maybe this time we'll start with Dr. Dunn, just because that gives us a good example, gives us a good starting place.
Sure. I think that there's a great promise here in that we have these objective measures of behaviors and physiology that we can develop from wearable sensors or digital health devices. And so that is, I think, the hope in all of this. And so I think really what we need are more rigorous validation studies of the link between the sensor detection and the behavior that we're trying to detect, or the physiologic change that we're trying to detect. So behaviors are a little bit more straightforward. When we think about sort of a self-harm behavior, for example, there may be a specific hand motion associated with that, or there may be a specific pain response associated with that is actually detectable objectively from a sensor. When we start to think less about behaviors, again, with addiction, we already have algorithms to detect cigarette smoking. So this is very doable. Behaviors to thoughts and emotions, that becomes a lot more challenging because thoughts and emotions are very difficult to define objectively. So, I think there's a lot of work to be done, both on the side of objectively sort of defining what we mean by a thought or emotion, and ideally linking that to a physiologic response that is objectively measurable. But that would get us that step closer. So really, the goal is to go from sort of more abstract concepts to things that are directly observable and measurable using a sensor. And I'm curious to hear what the other panelists have to say about this as well.
Dr. Radinsky, thoughts?
Sure. So maybe even tackling this from a direction of patients that already suffer from other comorbidities. We already know that a behavioral health condition can actually make it worse. So instead of measuring the behavioral health case, saying if we improve this by different type of interventions with regard to behavioral health, and we see improvement in the physical situation of a patient, for example, their chronic condition, that can be a really good proxy with regard to whether we actually made a difference. And I'm pretty sure that in the future, we can actually correlate this with additional sensors, et cetera. There's a lot of challenge of actually getting data to this, getting people adherence, even getting some access to this type of data, but actually monitoring the other conditions that they have is already in place practice. So that's the direction I would be pushing for. Of course, then other directions is looking for anomalies in other types of data that we have, which is mostly behavior of patients on different social media. There have been correlations around depression, etc., which is not even driven by the member themselves, but how other friends are reacting to their behavior. So many studies show that what your friends are thinking about you, this is probably what's happening to you. So maybe even measuring the thoughts of the closest surrounding of the specific person and measuring what they think with different type of questionnaires, etc., might be an interesting way of measuring this over time.
Great. Dr. Winsberg?
Yeah, thanks. I think the Dr. Dunn and Radinsky have brought up great points. And what I would add to that is that, we can, along with, to Dr. Radinsky's point, lacking a proxy measurement in behavioral health. We don't have one number we can look to. If we're looking at metabolic disease, for instance, a lot of people will use weight as a proxy. We don't have a particular biomarker or metric that we can look to in mental health. But I think we can gather a lot of data that perhaps serve as proxy measurements. The things that haven't been mentioned that I think are interesting are voice, text. A lot of therapies are happening over text-based now. And so, you know, what can we learn from people's language, the way that they're typing, the words that they're using, the syntax? What can we learn from perhaps voice recognition? Certainly social interactions are, you know, to Dr. Radinsky's point about social media, very important, the way they're moving around their environment, around the city, search data. These are all rich sources of data that may provide proxy measurements and early detection of risk. I think what needs to sort of get acknowledged are the privacy concerns around this sort of big brother monitoring. And what seems important to me is patient engagement. And in other words, if somebody is going to opt in to this kind of monitoring because they know they may have a chronic condition like bipolar disorder or something that could benefit from daily tracking, you know, getting patients to opt in and consent to this kind of monitoring with the notion that, you know, they will have access to a stepped care model where we may be able to recognize what treatment they need at any given moment. And what this will of course help us to do is understand patients' needs and then trigger, you know, interventions and measure outcomes that are not self-reported, to your point, you know, measure outcomes that have a more objective basis to them. But I think there is potentially really rich data in things like facial recognition, text, voice, micro expressions. There's good research around all of these modalities, and we've been you know, they're difficult to implement and difficult to get consent for, but quite promising.
Thanks, Dr. Diamond.
Sure, thanks. You know, as I think about some of the challenges around validation for some of these products, I can share a bit from our perspective at FDA, where, you know, we actively oversee just a subset of the products within the broad umbrella of digital health products that Megan talked about at the beginning of this meeting. And, you know, we weigh the benefits and the risk of products. We try to look at the totality of the evidence, and we evaluate and regulate products based on their intended use. So for a developer who may be struggling with validation data because of the challenges that my colleagues mentioned, you know, it can be possible to look broadly at, you know, what is actually, how is my product intended to be used, in what context, what is the role that it plays? For example, does it provide an independent intervention? Is it an adjunctive therapy? Does it support a patient as they're being cared for by someone else? And sometimes when there may not be enough evidence or validation to support a product that may have a higher risk, if the product has a lower risk because of its intended use, there may be less of a requirement on the validation side because of that balance of benefit and risk. And then it may be possible to gather more data with the real world use of the product once it is marketed that can then support, you know, an iterative development of the product and a progressive intended use. So in other words, if there are other ways to make a product lower risk, you know, if it's clear that a person using the product is under the care of a healthcare provider as opposed to being used independently, other factors that you know, sometimes we can do our best to increase the evidence and the level of validation, and other times we can adjust the overall balance of benefit and risk and still give access to products for patients. So I hope that's helpful.
That's great. And I think actually this next question is going to really be right up your alley. In fact, as we sort of talk about this question is sort of how we sort of validate technologies that may sort of either be monitoring vulnerable, you know, sort of mental health states or what have you. I think another big challenge in that space has been that at least, you know, most of the sort of regulatory framework in the US anyway seems to focus on sort of companies making specific sort of medical marketing claims. So, in that world, how can we sort of ensure that companies actually do the work to validate the tools or algorithms that they create for, doing things like monitoring or detecting some of these kind of either sort of pre-diagnostic concepts or vulnerable states or whatever, given that formal mechanism for enforcing it may be sort of unclear, or, how can we sort of incentivize them doing that evaluation piece and sharing their results in that way? This one's for you, Dr. Diamond.
Yep. So it's a great question, and I would point to a few areas. One is, I think that the sooner a developer comes and talks to us at the FDA, the more that we can provide guidance and earlier on the type of evidence that would be required. And it really is very specific to the application, to the patient population, to the type of intervention or diagnostic tool or device. And so again, come early, come often. There are a number of mechanisms that are from the formal mechanism of a pre-submission, or what might be called a 513G. I'm just throwing out a term that describes a meeting between a developer and FDA. But there are more informal mechanisms that, and we have, for example, a website, which is just digitalhealth@fda.hhs.gov, where you can write to us with an idea that you have or a question, and we can provide some informal response, usually rather quickly, within a week or two at most. And sometimes we'll point to guidance that we've written that the developer may not be familiar with. For example, we put out a whole guidance on general wellness products and what types of claims, as you mentioned, require FDA review, and what types of claims that may be related to stress management, for example, or other areas that are not areas of active oversight by FDA. So I think that this is a really important mechanism. And for the products that are not actively regulated by the agency, we really look to the community to develop standards. There are collaborative communities where we participate in, but they're formed by other groups that include patient advocacy groups, healthcare providers, and manufacturers. There are accredited standards organizations. And so I think all of these efforts are important for the spectrum of digital health products.
Great. Let me put it to the rest of the group, because I know several of you have also written or spoken about this issue too. So maybe Dr. Dunn, would you share some thoughts?
Sure. So, I think there's a lot of challenges when it comes to sort of verification and validation of digital health tools in general, and then layering that into mental health specific applications. It becomes even more challenging for some of the reasons that I brought up earlier. But we actually are involved with a community through the Digital Medicine Society, also called the DIME Society, that is working with the FDA and a large group of stakeholders as a part of this initiative called the Data CC, which is to try to determine kind of what are the minimum standards that these digital health products should be held to. And in these different realms, when we have this distinction between what is a medical device and what is a claim that's to be used toward wellness, sort of where does the responsibility of the FDA oversight lie? Where does the responsibility of the company lie? We even get into some tricky things with the FTC and regulating sort of consumer led claims. And so we actually find that there are these pockets of claims that are kind of lacking oversight. And when we talk about mental health, a lot of times it can be confusing whether that is a wellness claim or whether that is a medical claim. And so the fact that we have these pockets that are kind of lacking regulatory oversight becomes a little bit dangerous. So there's definitely a lot that needs to be done in this area to determine, what is going to be considered sort of a health or medical intervention. And at that level, how much do we need to validate what that intervention results in. What are those outcomes? So do we really need large clinical trials to validate claims that are being made? But then we have the other side of the coin where that can block innovation and kind of prevent this rapid dissemination of useful tools. So there's a lot of trade-offs, I think, that remain to be discussed here. And I think over the coming years, it will be very interesting to see how this all plays out.
It definitely will, and I hope folks are continuing to have those discussions. Dr. Dunn, you were
just to add, Jessilyn, I think the collaborative community you mentioned through DIME is a great example, and it's one of the types of forums that I was talking about. And you know, if a product is not actively regulated by the FDA, generally it is by the FTC. So there is regulation in place. It's just different, and they're treated differently.
I might just add regulation and enforcement, because I know that with the FTC, they've sort of decided not to enforce some of these wellness claims, and that I think has been a challenge that we've seen. But I'm curious, Dr. Diamond, if that's something that you've seen happen in practice.
Well, I think you raised a good point. There are a number of areas where, for example, the FDA has decided to use an enforcement discretion policy. And we do this in areas where we feel that there's significant benefit and where there is not significant risk to patients, and where we feel that our enforcement might have the inadvertent effect of squelching innovation for products that generally benefit the population. So that is what at least our enforcement discretion policy is intended to accomplish.
That's great. Dr. Radinsky, any thoughts?
Well, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on anything on the legal side and how all of those should be approached. I also wanted to raise a little bit about the measurement of those. What we've seen a lot of times that a lot of those interventions in behavioral health almost serve as a digital placebo. In other words, the actual use of digital technology was what's driving the effect and not the actual intervention itself. I'll give you an example. We've seen that when patients are actually journaling what they're feeling and their thoughts, and they know that somebody's going to review this in a week or 2 or 3, eventually this would actually make the difference. And I didn't see enough studies actually studying the actual impact of the intervention itself versus even comparing this to a placebo event. So those I would love to see addressed, as we see in other treatments that we do for other chronic conditions.
Great, Dr. Winsberg.
Yeah, I'd echo what Dr. Radinsky says. I think there is certainly a digital placebo factor at work. That may also represent some level of behavioral activation, which we know is therapeutic. But I think what I would like to see, and I think what we will need to see, is just more peer-reviewed articles coming from some of these innovative companies. And that do subject the data to more scrutiny and perhaps higher standards than what is currently being reported in terms of outcomes. I think that the benefit of the current Wild West environment, if you will, is we're able to collect very large data sets that probably haven't been so easily accessible through clinical trials. And so being able to look at very large numbers and have granular data on those patients can perhaps move the needle in everything from diagnostic categories, as we've previously discussed, to digital phenotyping and treatment selection. And so I think that it is a balance between certainly regulation, as long as I think there's a human layer involved right now. There's an opportunity to collect much larger data sets.
Absolutely, and certainly it sounds like at least on the sort of regulatory end, we're still sort of sorting a lot of things out, but certainly a lot of sort of social trust and sort of relying on a lot of organizations and companies to sort of have integrity and really sort of do the validation that it takes and sort of hopefully make some of those sort of existing systems that we already use, like peer review and publication, utilizing those as well to sort of share data and sort of offer that proof of concept. So maybe we could just switch gears from this kind of monitoring early detection sort of area a bit and sort of shift focus a little bit to another area I think in mental health is pretty exciting. We haven't really had a chance to talk about just yet. One of the areas that many of you are also very active in is in this idea of drug detection and treatment personalization, like drug matching for mental health issues. And of course, there's a huge need for that in a ton of different areas, all across mental health. But one area that stands out, of course, as kind of most in need or particularly in need is in depression, since, as we all know, that it's sadly very prevalent and, something like 70% of patients don't tend to respond well to the first drug that they're prescribed. So another, pretty exciting area, of course, that digital tools are being used is in this area of sort of developing techniques that try to match patients with medications that may be more likely to offer them some improvement sort of their first time out. But at least in some of these kind of high profile studies that we've seen come out in the last few years on this very topic haven't really shown the kind of benefit or clinical effectiveness more so than the sort of status quo guess and check method that we use right now. So what do we need to do differently here in order to sort of start realizing clinical benefits? And Dr. Winsberg, why don't you start us out with that one?
Yeah, this is a subject near and dear to my heart because I've spent a fair bit of time developing algorithms around digital phenotyping. And I think, you're right in pointing out that depression, for instance, is a very heterogeneous condition. And we've been drawing on for some time on, a kind of tired category of drugs to address a lot of heterogeneity in a particular diagnosis. And one opportunity, for instance, that exists in digital health is this idea of getting a more granular view of a patient's symptom through data collection, and in doing so, be able to predict which drug treatment they may respond to. We've implemented this at Brightside through a symptom cluster analysis that we believe allows us to select a more appropriate treatment to begin with. And I think when you look at the typical effect size of any individual antidepressant, it's in the 35% range. Whereas at Brightside, what we're seeing, and we haven't yet published this, but we'll soon, we're seeing that we're able to choose the right drug about just shy of 70% of the time, 69.5% of the time for a patient. And that paired with the idea that we can get a sizable remission rate at 12 weeks is very exciting. And I think what this involves really is a more careful digital phenotyping of the patient, symptom cluster analysis. And I think the silver lining of all this is back to sort of this original question of is the DSM objective really? When we think about a diagnosis depression, for instance, a patient has to meet one of two primary criteria and then have 5 of 9 symptoms. So if you think about all the permutations involved, 2 patients can share one symptom and both have a depression diagnosis. And we're looking at like well over 300 permutations. You think about the fact that some of those symptoms are bivalent and that a patient could be sleeping too much or sleeping too little, eating too much, eating too little. Those permutations then increase even further. And so we're looking at a lot of different permutations if we can be more specific in targeting those symptoms. And we do have a wide variety of drugs available in our armamentarium. Just with the current pipeline, we can be a lot more precise in the way we deliver treatment. And then by taking an ML AI approach to a large data set, for instance, when we were sitting on at Brightside, that can help then determine, well, what does an objective condition look like? Like, are there biologic subtypes of depression that we can easily recognize that you can gather from a large data set like this that you can't from, let's say, a smaller clinical trial? So I think that's the exciting piece of it.
Dr. Radinsky?
So what would be also interested is, as we've seen a lot of physical conditions that you eventually combine different drugs and actually identify the right combinations, here also, how do you actually combine different type of interventions till you reach something which is successful? Let's see, even hypertension. You start with one drug, it doesn't work, then you increase, decrease, change the group of drugs. And even then, what is the right protocol to treat a lot of those patients? Even in a lot of chronic conditions, the protocols are changing almost every 3 years, but I don't see a lot of those happening in behavioral health. And for me, I would love to start thinking about this as a chronic condition and how to treat it with time. How do we change this? What are the checkups? How do we change the interventions? Maybe increase one intervention and decrease the other one.
Dr. Diamond?
Yes, I mean, we definitely support the innovation in this area. The more that medical therapy can be personalized to patients, it's just that brings tremendous benefit. From our perspective, we would encourage developers to be, as clear and specific as possible in terms of who should be using a product like this, whether it's a healthcare practitioner, and how they should use it. If it's possible to describe what the basis of the decision making is by the product, either generally or specifically for a patient, we find that's helpful for us, and actually we see it contributing to the trust in a product like that and success. But absolutely, we really think this is a promising area.
Dr. Dunn?
Yeah, so building upon what Dr. Winsberg was saying about sort of unsupervised learning and clustering of these large data sets, I think there's a lot of promise in bringing together data from multiple sources. So we have this idea of kind of multimodal monitoring. So bringing the genetic background into consideration to understand sort of who's a rapid metabolizer of certain drug types, in addition to some of the physiologic and behavioral data and some of the more subjective self-reported data that provides a lot of promise. And I think one thing that we're currently lacking that could really improve our ability to track how well drugs do and kind of learn from that is to develop learning health systems where we have patients that are naturally undergoing these sorts of treatments, but we're not bringing that data together from different health centers to learn what's going on because of how fragmented our health system is. And it's not like we have a requirement to report the sort of efficacy of drugs the way we would an adverse event. And so I think that really limits our ability to bring together large data sets to learn from our existing health system. And so I hope in the future we see more of that happening.
Fantastic, thank you. So I think we're running out of time. So let me just do two things before we wrap it up today. So one is to get to our poll question, which is for the whole audience. And we've talked about a couple of different areas today that sort of shows particular promise when we think about digital tools for mental health. One is in this idea of sort of early detection and monitoring of vulnerable states. And the other was in sort of treatment matching. But tell us what you think a little bit about what you think the most promising areas are in terms of improving mental health and in terms of particularly improving public health. So if we were to invest in any one of these areas, what do you think the most sort of benefit that would provide? And the next, maybe just if we have a couple of seconds, I'll just go around to each of our panelists again one more time, just to say a couple of words about one of the things, the issues that I think is most pressing in kind of this field, and that is that we certainly have a lot of really interesting and promising tools for some of these things already. Like Dr. Dunn was mentioning earlier, we already have algorithms that can accurately detect cigarette smoking, for example, in real time. We can do that with drinking as well, and things like that. So it seems like we're never short on promise. But there's certainly a lot of barriers to getting these things actually in the hands of clinicians or having them be applied in clinical settings. So give us just a couple of quick words about what you think the biggest barriers are to helping these things sort of get out into the world. Whoever wants to start on this one.
I can dive in. I would say I think verification and validation is one big area. And then the other is implementation in our existing health system infrastructure, the way that our health system is so fractured, at least here in the US. So I think addressing both of those would bring that promise to bear much more quickly.
I would agree with Dr. Dunn on the fractured healthcare system. You know, a lot of times health systems are afraid of being given data because then that puts responsibility on them to use that data. And so it can present, you know, some ethical concerns. I think that along with the privacy concerns I raised earlier, that's certainly a barrier to implementation. You need buy-in from all parties, providers and patients. You know, I think regulatory bodies, of course, provide some barrier to implementation when it comes to you know, removing that final human decision layer, which I don't think we're ready for prime time yet anyway. So so those are my thoughts.
I'll go next. I think every time that we deploy something in the US healthcare system, we need to think about ROI. What I've seen with a lot of those interventions is even if they do have some legitimate clinical impact, they're very costly. I'll give a quick example. Let's say we would take all of the PCPs of serious mental illness patients and change them to 5 psychiatrists. Amazing program. Actually would get to a reduction in behavioral health admissions, inpatient admissions, etc. But you also need a primary care physician, and it's also extremely expensive to work with 5 psychiatrists. So I think a lot of those things, when you actually hit the ground, really understand how they work, you really need to think about the ROI. Otherwise, it will not make sense economically to deploy them. So first of all, making sure that they're validating work clinically, then how do you actually make sense financially to deploy all of them to the right people?
Great, Dr. Dunn.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that I will highlight is the challenge of transparency. We really do encourage all developers to be as transparent as possible on you know, how their products have been developed, how they've been validated, how they are intended to be used. Are there circumstances where they should not be used? I think this is really helpful, and it can build trust and contribute to adoption. And you know, as a regulatory body, we do our best to be transparent as well, and we'll continue to do that in terms of the regulatory status and regulatory framework for these products.
Great, thank you all again so much for the good discussion and for being here. Really appreciate it. You're certainly all doing awesome work, and it's definitely super interesting to talk about some of these pretty thorny, difficult challenges for the field. So thanks again.